Once your bag is finished like this, you have the option to add boxed corners. And what that does, it creates sort of a squared off bottom, and it gives the bag a little bit more structure, so that makes it easier for it to stand up on its own. Of course, it also depends on what fabric you're using. If you're using a thicker fabric, makes it easier. Also, smaller sizes stand up better, but overall, it just gives a nice touch to the bag. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to be using a French seam to create the boxed corners, and it will have a really nice and clean finish on the inside. The full pattern includes measurements that you can use for the different size bags, and how far you go from the tip will determine the final depth of the bag. And you can easily customize this in the Excel sheet. And for this small bag, I'm going to go in 1 centimeter from the tip for the first line of stitches, and it will result in a depth of about 3 centimeters, which is about 1 1/8 of an inch. The end result will always be slightly different because of small deviations in when you measure or sew, the thickness of the material, and also the fact that this seam is sewn on the bias. That means that it's prone to stretch a little bit, which of course in a tiny seam like this you won't notice much of a difference, but for the larger seams it will turn out a little bit larger. We're going to be working on the right side of the bag, and first you need to fold it on the French seam here. And there's going to be a fabric fold on the other side. Then we're going to measure from the tip here, measuring down to where the stitch line starts and ends. So I'm measuring 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to mark the line to make it easier. This is just a tiny seam, but once the corners get bigger, there's quite a big area for you to sew over, and you don't really have a lot of reference on the way, so it's nice to mark that with a water-soluble pen or chalk. Right, so this is ready to sew. As you can see, it's just a tiny seam from the markings that we made. Now I need to trim off this little tip. You want to leave about 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch. And then we're going to turn the bag inside out. So if you're doing a bigger seam, I would press this, but because it's tiny and I can just roll it between my fingers so that it's nicely folded on the stitch line. You need to pay attention to which way the French seam is stitched down at the point here, because you also need to fold the French seam that way, so it's not twisted like this. They're both at both ends, it's folded to the same side. Okay, once that's done, you're going to sew a second line of stitches that will encase the raw edge. And because our total seam allowance was 5/8 of an inch or 1.6 centimeters, 16 millimeters, we need to sew a seam that's half that. So 8 millimeters or 5/16 of an inch. You can just eyeball it, or again, you can measure that out, but you don't want to measure that on the fold here. It actually has to be parallel to the edge there. So from the edge to the stitch line is going to be 8 millimeters or 5/16 of an inch. So I've sewn all the way from the edge to the edge, and now your box corner is finished. So you can see the difference between the two. This one lays nice and flat, and this one creates a little bit more dimension in the bag.